I love the scent of lilac, and although we can't quite capture a scent on paper, we can always enjoy the beautiful color palette and all the violet, pink, and purple transitions that are practically made for watercolor painting. This is also a wonderful opportunity to practice different watercolor greens, and so that's what we're breaking down in today's video. How to paint the lilac flower step by step, capturing subtle variations in color, and I will give you my pigment recommendations and also explain how I layered the pigments to get the details right. How to paint the green leaves, including mixing blues and violets into your green pigments to achieve a natural effect and light and shadows. Of course, I will show you up close how the details were done, and spoiler alert, it's my favorite negative painting technique. Finally, we'll talk about the background techniques, and that's where you can really let your creativity run wild and introduce all sorts of colors, blending them on wet paper. This technique is so satisfying. So let's get started. My reference photo, as always, is in the video description below. My Patreon supporters who help me grow and maintain this channel will be able to download a black and white outline drawing, and we'll see a real-time recording version of this video with some additional commentary. We will focus on the most important techniques today, so let's get started. I'm painting on Arches paper, cold press. It's 12 by 12 inches block, so quite large, but we need the scale in order to get the details. And I will be using a variety of round brushes from size 12 for large background washes to size 2 for small flower details. And the color palette can be broken down into 3 categories, which you will see below, and I will call out specific pigments as I use them. Note that in general, you don't need to limit yourself to one specific brand, but you want your pigments to be transparent or semi-transparent so we can layer them on top of one another. Flower pigments will be the most important if you want to match my palette, but greens you can mix and experiment by adding different proportions of yellow and blue or using some greens straight from the tube. Background pigments are entirely up to you, or you can even choose to skip the background altogether. Finally, it's best to reuse the colors, as I always mention this in my tutorials, just to keep your palette cohesive. So for example, I will be mixing my Quinacridone Violet into my greens, and I will be adding it into the background. This really helps achieve a cohesive look throughout the painting. Let's start with the leaves and the stem, because this is how I started the painting, and the reason why I found it helpful to do the stem first is because once it's there, and notice that it's quite dark so it stands out against the violet, it will be easier to arrange the small flowers around it. Also, I want to make sure that I have a straight line, and even though the petals cover the stem in some areas, once I have the small portions painted, I will be able to assess whether it looks like a straight continuous line. Let's work with our basic warm green, starting at the bottom and transition to warmer green all the way on top, because the stem is getting more light on top. And I may occasionally even mix a little bit of Perylene Maroon, which is what I use for my brown, into my green at the bottom to really make sure the bottom part looks like it's in the shadow. Feel free to mix your own warm green here. You can use a combination of blue and yellow. You can also use Perylene green straight from the tube, transitioning to something lighter like a spring green. You can also add other colors like purple to make it darker. Purple will mix very well with green. It will look natural since there will be lots of purple around eventually as we add our flowers. Now let's do the first layer of our leaves, and we want to end up with something like this by the end of the step. And this is of course simply an underpainting, meaning we will follow up with several layers of shadows and textures on top, but we will really want to get this first layer of color correctly. And my trick here is usually to look not just at the overall color of the leaf, but specifically at the color of the leaf veins, because as we add more and more color on top, we will paint around those thin veins using negative painting technique, and they will maintain that initial color that we put down. So here I use my medium green, my Hooker's green from Daniel Smith. covering the entire surface of the leaf, and you may choose to transition to something warmer like olive green or sap green, or simply add a little bit of warm yellow to your green as you get down and to the left. For this large leaf in the center of the composition, we will need to start very light. It's in direct sunlight, and later we will be painting some intricate shadows on it. But for now, let's go with a cool green. I used Aqua green from Winsor & Newton, but you can go with something even more blue like Phthalo turquoise, or use your base green and add some blue into it. And as we move down, let's start adding some warmer greens. Here you can just go with a yellowish green straight from the tube. I really like how Daniel Smith Phthalo yellow green looks, or you may even go with green gold, also a good option. Again, the main thing in this step is to keep it super light. If you're comfortable with negative painting and your brush has a very defined tip, try painting around the leaf veins, leaving them completely dry, like I'm doing here. In the outline file that I've prepared for my Patreon supporters, I've outlined the veins with a thinner stroke. Let's leave this first half of the leaf to dry and switch to the smaller leaf. Continue with your yellow-green here, whether it's a mixture you've made or a yellow-green straight from the tube. Just cover the leaf on the right-hand side, and then as you move down and to the left, switch back to cooler green with some blue in it. Same value, very, very light here. While it's drying, let's switch back to the larger leaf and finish the other side. Start with your light blue-green and transition to warmer, darker green. The underpainting on this leaf at the bottom will be light. You can use the same warm green, very light. This will become the color of the leaf veins eventually as we add darker green on top in the next step. Transition to your cool green containing blue towards the tip. A bit darker, warmer green in the background here. And finally, let's finish off the other side of the large leaf, making sure to keep the veins blank. Now let's paint these lilac flowers, starting with the first layer. And I have my pigments on the palette, and I'm starting at the bottom with a very light Quinacridone Violet, and following with a mixture of Dioxazine purple and Phthalo blue green shade all the way here at the bottom and on the right. In order to paint a lilac flower, I want you to first consider two things. The first one is the natural color transitions we have throughout the flower cluster. Here you can use some very gentle variations of pigments, from deeper, cooler blues at the bottom, and I used the combination of Phthalo blue green shade and Dioxazine purple from Aqua, to cold pinks, and for that I've used Quinacridone Violet and Magenta, and all the way to warmer pink on the buds, and I used Quinacridone Red there. The only other pigment I used on our lilac is gold ochre from Winsor & Newton, and feel free to use any warm yellow. It's just for those small anthers in the center of some open flowers. The second thing I wanted to mention is consider how the light hits the flower, creating shadows and highlight areas. Notice that lilac bloom actually contains a whole bunch of tiny flowers that form a cluster, a soft cone-like shape called panicle, I believe. And of course, a shape like that will interact with light a certain way, collecting highlights here and shadows over there, as if it was a solid shape. So our first layer of color has to be a solid shape as well. And we will need to adjust the tone by adding more water to our pigments in the highlight areas right here, and maybe even leaving some parts blank to indicate highlights. You can use this principle on any multi-flower bloom, like for example a hydrangea flower, which I've already done a tutorial on here on YouTube, and I will be doing another more extensive one soon. I will link to the hydrangea video in the video description below. Notice how light my mixture is. Lots of water for this first layer. Just gently cover all the flowers with this mixture, slowly approaching the middle portion where we will switch to Magenta. You can simplify this palette, as I've mentioned, and start with blue, mixing it into magenta slowly. Notice that right here next to green leaves, I'm almost exclusively using pure phthalo blue. It's because the leaves will be reflecting up, and blue is so close to green on the spectrum than, say, violet. We want to have a very realistic, cohesive color transition, so let's use the color spectrum to inform our color choices. Somewhere around here, I'm completely switching to magenta and violet. And as I get all the way up, I'm using Quinacridone red, which is the warmest pigment on this flower if you consider the color spectrum. Those buds are also much more saturated in the reference photos, so here you can have less water and more pigment. I decided to go with Quinacridone red, and you can use any of your favorite medium reds like carmine or alizarin crimson. If you watched my tutorial on painting evening light on the pink rose, you know I use Quinacridone red quite often. In general, I love Quinacridone family of pigments. They are very transparent but also staining, so you can get a gorgeous gradient from very light pink to more saturated red as we build up our layers. Try to leave a few highlights completely white. We're not using masking fluid or any other way to preserve white highlights, although you might come back and paint them with white gouache later. It's not going to be the exact same effect. You want to leave white paper where you see the brightest highlights. It's really the only way to create a sense of pure white with watercolor. So just use the tip of your brush here and gently work around those highlights if you can. And let's not forget those smaller flower buds peeking out at the bottom, and let's use our purple there. For the second step on the leaves, we have something a lot more simple. Just use your medium green. I'm using Hooker's green from Daniel Smith. You can see I put a little bit of that Hooker's green on the palette, and I'm adding just a little bit of Quinacridone Violet to it to keep the palette more cohesive, because our flowers will be somewhat violet. If you're not using violet, try blue or purple from your flower palette. This will help make your green darker, and the overall look will be much more cohesive, echoing the violet tones in the flower cluster. Paint around the thin veins with the tip of your brush. Experiment by adding more or less violet as you move through the leaf. And as you get to the tip where the leaf bends, simply use a darker version of your blue-green that you've already used in that area. The second layer of color for this smaller leaf facing us will be very simple. I'm just adding a bit more saturation, leaving a thin line in the middle without any color. So just basically paint, focusing on adding more vibrant color around the edges, warmer on the right and cooler on the left. Now let's do the second layer for this leaf that's facing to the side. It's really in the shadow, so let's use the same mixture as the one we did in the first step. I'm mixing Hooker's green with Quinacridone Violet, and on the darker parts I'm adding my Perylene green. It's very, very dark there, and you can try adding something like Dioxazine purple if you want, or mixing alizarin crimson into your base green if you don't have Perylene green. Now the second layer on this large leaf, remember we want to keep it super light, so for the most part I will just cover it with clear water that has a tiny bit of aqua green, and add some more vibrant pigments around the edges, wet on wet, letting them spread. On the right hand side and on the tip, I will go with cooler pigments, introducing that Perylene green again, and you can simply add some blue and red into your base green. Now I'll finish off the top part and maybe add a bit more intensity to that shadow in the middle. We will come back to this leaf again and add a bit more color. I wasn't planning on adding another layer at this point, but I feel like it's coming out too light and boring. So let me add a splash of warm color around the edges. For the second layer of color on the lilac flower cluster, once again, we're not painting individual flowers just yet, but rather building value and saturation on the entire cluster. And you may actually skip this step if your first layer is saturated enough, but I found that mine lacked intensity, especially at the bottom, and I added another layer, really focusing on the darker shadow areas and not touching those areas in the light right on top at all. I used the same pigments, just slightly more saturated, starting with Phthalo blue, Dioxazine purple, and Magenta. Notice that I've extended my blue all the way across over to the green leaf, softening the edge between the green and our lilac. It works here because we're essentially painting the same shadow on the spot, the one that covers that part of the flower and that dark green leaf. So green and blue are close together on the spectrum, and this will be a very smooth, natural transition. Notice that each individual flower has this tubular base. Sometimes they're visible and they're much more saturated than the petals, so I added some extra color there. Let's move on to the very top of the flower, and here let's bring out warmer reds and maybe some magenta and violet if you're using an extended palette. And let's add more saturation to the flower buds. Simply using one color will work just fine. Don't worry so much about the color variation here. Just do what is comfortable for you and focus on getting the light and shadow areas right. I'm going to finish off by adding a bit of yellow in the center of this bud, but also while I'm at it to other flowers, wherever I see the yellow anthers in the middle, just a tiny dot. I'm going to wrap this step up by adding one more layer, and this one is really about definition. I want to add more pigment to those tube-like flower legs and some purple shadows at the bottom. Really starting to see some definition now. A great starting point for our next step where we will do the details on the petals. Now that we have the first two layers of the greenery, we can add a background, which by the way is completely optional step, but stay with me for a few minutes if you want to see how this was done. So we're working towards something like this, and the key considerations to keep in mind are the level of detail. Here less is more, as we want to keep the focus on detailed flower clusters and the green leaves with the shadows. So let's use some very gentle color transitions, and the best technique for this is wet on wet, meaning I pre-wet the paper with clear water all the way to the edge of the paper block, and then I start introducing colors very slowly just around the lilac, and you can see they spread out into the clear water, flowing and forming a very soft edge. It helps sometimes to tilt the paper, as you can see I did here, by putting masking tape behind the paper block. In terms of the colors, you're probably thinking, why not use blue? If you've seen my tutorial on watercolor backgrounds, you know that blue almost always works as a background because our eyes are conditioned to perceive cooler blues as being further away. I will leave a link to this tutorial in the video description below, and you can definitely use blue here. Something like Indothrone blue would work amazing and really make the flowers pop. But I wanted to do something different, in this case much more subtle, so I went with a variation of the flower palette we're already using. It's always a good idea to recycle your colors, so you can see I'm using the same Quinacridone Violet, a little bit of Perylene Green and Perylene Violet, maybe some cool bluish green on top, and this is my Aqua Green, the same one we used for the large leaf in the center of the composition. Maybe even some warm green to suggest some sunlight coming through. Lastly, I wanted to mention the edge softening technique, and you may often see me use it in my paintings. It's very helpful, and all it is simply extending your background color layer onto some of the elements that are in the foreground. So You will see me extend my cooler green from the background and all the way across that leaf on the left, just forcing it to recede into the background visually. Now let's add something similar to the right hand side, maybe a bit more brown this time, and I'm using Perylene Maroon instead of a brown, and maybe a little bit of green. I'm also going to add a bit of light blue, my Phthalo blue, maybe some purple and even orange, just to suggest some branches that are far away. At the bottom, my background color is mostly just my base green, and note that I will carry it all the way across the large green leaf that's in the shadow. Here I went with my base hooker's green mixed with Quinacridone Violet and added some Perylene green to cool it off in certain places. You can use your blue instead. And I added some Perylene Violet for the branches, wet on wet, so there are no sharp edges. Let's let this layer dry, work some more on the leaves, and then come back again for another layer on the background when we know exactly how dark we want it to be. And now it's time to work on individual flowers, painting each tiny petal with the tip of my brush. And you should have a good starting point of some base color layers by now. A nice color transition from cooler blues to purples and all the way to warmer pinks on top. This will help us hold the entire flower cluster palette together, and this is why we needed those first layers, those underpainting layers. We will use the same colors again, but now instead of considering the entire cluster and how it interacts with sunlight, let's zoom in on each individual flower and look at every petal and try to add some color wet on dry, meaning with wet brush with some color on it, we're painting on dry paper. Don't get too stressed out about this step. It's quite a tedious task, but here are a few tips that will definitely make it easier for you. Number one, you may want to simply focus on a few flowers, especially the ones in the background, and make them a little bit darker. This will bring out the flowers that are closer to us that you're leaving without any color and make them pop. Add some warm brown. I used Perylene Maroon to add some spots between the petals. This alone will help you add definition to your cluster. Another thing that's relatively easy but effective in terms of helping you achieve realism is painting those darker central parts around each yellow anther. So use purple or brown just around the yellow dots. Finally, notice that each petal has a slight fold, and so for the most part, we're adding color only in the center of the flower, not touching the folded parts as they get more light from different directions. And this will help us define the petal shape even more. Let's work on this flower together. It's easy to see my strokes here. It's quite light in the reference photo, and notice that unlike every other flower here, it has 5 petals. They say if you find a 5-petal lilac, it's really good luck. So I've covered the center of each petal with a light mixture, just a little bit of violet, maybe some blue, but super light, and I left the edges blank. And by the edges, I mean those folded parts of the petal. And then around the yellow anther in the center, I just added some violet, but a lot more saturated. As we move up the flower buds, don't forget to only add color on the shadow areas, and also those tube-like parts of the flower buds need some bright saturated color, so I'm using magenta and violet. Leave the highlights white. Once our second layer of green leaves is dry and there's already some background color, if you choose to paint a background, it's time to add some vibrancy and definition to the leaves. I will start off with the small front-facing leaf using my base green, my hooker's green, and maybe a little bit of blue mixed into it in some places. And I will add a few lines with the tip of my brush and also some shadows wet on dry and blending them with clear water. Wet on dry just means you have wet paint on your brush and you're painting over entirely dry surface. There is this beautiful shadow on the large leaf, and it's such an important part of this painting. Super intricate. It will draw the eye. So let's make sure we are absolutely accurate here, and I will make it easier for myself and add an outline with my pencil. It helps to use very hard pencil here that doesn't have a lot of graphite marks. So I'm using something like 3H or 4H. And now using my aqua green, or in your case it can be just a cooler green mixture with some blue in it, just paint the shadows carefully. Maybe add some Perylene green into it on some spots that are closer to the flowers. You can also add a violet there, or purple wet on wet right into the green while it is drying. I ended up extending the shadow color all the way up into the backgrounds, softening the edge between the leaf and everything that's visible behind it. You can also add some definition to the shadows that are on the tip. So start with your cooler green and blend it with clear water towards the center of the leaf. And maybe some extra color, but here it's best to keep your green on the warmer side. So maybe add more yellow into it. We're almost there. The third layer of color on this leaf will be dark and very simple. No more painting around the veins. Just simply cover the entire surface with your base green, leaving a few highlights blank. So you can also add a few leaves in the background. It's really up to you. I didn't want to spend too much time on them so they wouldn't take attention away from the main flower, but I did end up putting down a few layers, just trying to capture the basic shape and some larger shadows that I saw in the reference photo. It's completely optional, of course. You may choose not to paint those background elements at all and simplify your composition by focusing only on the flower and the main leaves. Let this layer dry completely, and at this point you can see that our cluster looks quite realistic. There is an opportunity to add a little bit more detail and definition, so this is completely optional, but I did add a bit more value and a few small details on the flower petals, making sure that petals that are closer to us have better definition. And here a small brush in size 2, 1, or even 0 and more saturated pigment will be very helpful. I came back to my background one more time, tilting my paper block, and I've added a bit more value on the left and on the right. Really this time my main colors are Perylene Violet and Perylene Green. I'm simply trying to add a little bit more depth by creating high contrast between the flowers and the darker background. My technique is the same. I wet the paper with clear water almost all the way to the border of my paper to avoid unnecessary edges, and then I put my darker pigment right around the flower or the leaf in some cases. You will see in the end the result is a bit more warmer on the left and a bit cooler on the right, and that is on purpose. Since our source of light is on the left, I want to keep more warmth there, and on the right I almost exclusively used Perylene Green mixed with a little bit of Quinacridone Violet just to keep it darker, and the effect will be a bit deeper. I painted a little bit around those branches that I've identified in the first background layer, just making sure that they're a little bit more visible. And of course, if you are doing the background, don't forget to adjust the colors on those spots visible between the smaller lilac flowers. It's really important to keep the overall value consistent, so just check your background throughout your painting to make sure the overall look is cohesive. Some finishing touches now for the last step. I returned to my leaves one last time after the flowers were finished, and really this is an optional step and an opportunity to assess the overall color balance and the balance of light and shadow, and maybe add more value and saturation as you see fit. This really depends on your style and your preferences. We can't really erase or change watercolors once the main layers are down, but we can often make adjustments in color temperature and value by glazing color on top of what's already there. And if you want to see a more detailed tutorial on glazing techniques specifically, I will link the video in the description below. So that's exactly what I did, and by the end of the step my painting looked like this, and I focused on the following things. Number one, adding some extra leaves in the background without much detail, simply suggesting some shapes. And the rationale for doing this was to balance my composition and reinforce the sense of movement we already have in the flower. So you can see it's sort of on an angle like this. And adding more elements on the bottom left and top right helps me make that sense of movement even stronger. Number two, I added some darker, smaller branches using two pigments mainly, Perylene Violet and Dioxazine Purple. You can use something like Payne's Gray or Brown. It's really up to you. The main thing is to keep these shapes quite basic without adding too much detail that will take away attention from the flower. I also worked to really adjust the temperature on the shadows of those larger leaves in the center. I found once the first layers dried out that they looked too light and also too warm. So I went over the shadow areas again with my aqua green, and you can simply use a transparent cool blue or maybe even something like Phthalo turquoise and just cool those areas off by glazing the blue on top if you feel like it turned out too warm, as it did in my case. Make sure the underlying layers are completely dry when you glaze so you don't disturb the paint. A bit more background color on top right and bottom left, very loose, no detail at all, just some color splashes, wet on wet. Again, the placement is strategic here as I'm building a sense of direction from bottom left to top right and softening the edges by extending that background color onto the leaves in certain places. In the end, my lilac flower looked like this. I removed the masking tape and went on to edit this tutorial. Huge thank you again for my patrons. You will be able to find the full version of this tutorial in real time on my Patreon, along with outlines and some additional commentary. It's almost 4 hours long, so feel free to just watch certain chapters that you're interested in. I broke it down into flower and background and the leaves. And if you found this tutorial helpful, give it a like. Really appreciate your support. Have a great week ahead. I'll see you soon.